This 1899 portrait of a mother and her daughter seems innocent until you notice what's hidden in her lap. On March 15, 2024, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a senior curator at the Boston Historical Society, received a routine delivery that would fundamentally alter her understanding of post-Civil War Black American history. The item in question was a single albumin print photograph, measuring 8 by 10 inches, housed in a deteriorating cardboard box from an estate sale in Worcester County, Massachusetts. The photograph depicted a black family portrait from 1899, a mother seated centrally with 3 daughters positioned around her. At first examination, it appeared to be a standard studio portrait of the era, notable primarily for its rarity. Photographs of African-American families from this period are uncommon in historical archives, making any such discovery valuable for research purposes. Dr. Mitchell had been authenticating 19th century photographs for 17 years. Her methodology was systematic and thorough. She began by examining the paper stock, the mounting technique, and the chemical composition of the print itself. The albumin process, common between 1850 and 1890, involved coating paper with egg whites before applying light-sensitive silver salts. This particular print showed the characteristic yellowing and fine cracking consistent with authentic period photographs. The studio backdrop, a painted pastoral scene, matched the conventions of the time. The subject's clothing aligned with fashion trends of the late 1890s. The mother wore a high-collared black dress with lace detailing at the throat and cuffs. Her 3 daughters, aged approximately 7, 11, and 14, wore simpler cotton dresses appropriate to their ages and the family's apparent economic status. What made Dr. Mitchell pause, however, was the mother's expression. Unlike typical Victorian portrait subjects who maintain neutral or pleasant expressions, this woman's face conveyed something different, a wariness perhaps, or calculated defiance. Her posture was rigid, her hands positioned deliberately in her lap, obscured partially by the dark fabric of her dress. Dr. Mitchell retrieved her professional-grade magnifying loupe and positioned the photograph under the high-intensity examination lamp. She worked methodically, scanning from left to right, top to bottom, documenting every detail. The daughters' faces showed the expected nervousness of children sitting for formal portraits. The studio furniture appeared standard for the period. The painted backdrop depicted rolling hills and distant trees, a common motif meant to suggest gentility and pastoral peace. Then she saw it, partially concealed beneath the dark folds of fabric in the mother's lap, barely visible even under magnification, was the unmistakable outline of a small revolver. The metal caught the studio light in a way that the surrounding fabric did not, creating a subtle but definite contrast. The weapon's cylinder was visible, as was part of the grip. It had been positioned deliberately, hidden enough not to dominate the image, but present enough to be discovered by careful examination. Dr. Mitchell's breath caught. She adjusted the magnification and repositioned the light source. There was no question. This woman had deliberately hidden a weapon in her lap while sitting for a formal family portrait. And somehow, the photographer had either failed to notice or had chosen not to object. The implications were staggering. Family portraits in the Victorian era were expensive, formal occasions. Subjects dressed in their finest clothes, traveled to professional studios, and sat perfectly still for extended exposures. Every element was carefully controlled. For a weapon to appear in such a photograph, even partially hidden, suggested it was intentional. But why? What circumstances would lead a black mother in 1899 to feel the need to be armed even during a formal family portrait? Dr. Mitchell knew she had stumbled upon something far more significant than a curious photographic anomaly. This image was a historical document that demanded investigation. Dr. Mitchell immediately documented her finding with high-resolution digital photography, capturing the revolver's outline from multiple angles under different lighting conditions. She created a detailed examination report, noting the weapon's approximate size, position, and the fact that it appeared to be a small-caliber revolver consistent with models available in the 1890s. She then began the painstaking process of identifying the subjects in the photograph and understanding the context in which it was taken. The back of the photograph bore a studio mark embossed into the mounting board, J.R. Thompson Photographic Studio, Worcester, Massachusetts. Below this, a handwritten notation in faded brown ink read, Mrs. Eleanor and Daughters, September 1899. No surname was provided, which was not uncommon for photographs of black subjects during this period, a reflection of the systemic dehumanization embedded in record-keeping practices of the era. White subjects were typically identified with full names and sometimes addresses. Black subjects were often recorded with only first names or generic descriptors. Dr. Mitchell contacted the Worcester Historical Museum, providing them with high-resolution copies of the photograph and requesting access to any records related to J.R. Thompson's studio. Within 3 days, archivist Marcus Washington responded with preliminary findings. Thompson had operated his photography studio from 1892 to 1907 on Main Street in downtown Worcester, serving both white and black clients. A relatively progressive practice for the time, though his black clients were typically scheduled at different hours to avoid offending white customers. Most of Thompson's business records had been lost to a fire in 1910 that destroyed the building where his studio had been located. However, the Worcester Historical Museum had preserved several ledgers and a partial client list from the late 1890s, donated by Thompson's grandson in the 1960s. These documents had been cataloged but never thoroughly analyzed. The name Eleanor appeared twice in the September 1899 ledger. One entry was identified by full name and address, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, 45 Highland Street, a white family from a prosperous neighborhood. The second entry, dated September 12, 1899, listed only Eleanor, colored, with no address provided. The fee recorded was $1.50, which was standard for a family portrait of this type. A notation in the margin read, 6 prints requested, which was unusual. Most clients ordered 1 or 2 copies. 6 prints suggested the photographs were intended for distribution. Dr. Mitchell expanded her search to census records, church registries, property deeds, and tax records from Worcester County during the 1890s. The 1900 federal census, conducted just months after the photograph was taken, listed several black families in Worcester. The total black population of the city was approximately 600 people out of a total population of over 118,000. Among the black households enumerated in the census was one headed by Eleanor, age 38, listed as Negro under the race category. Her occupation was recorded as seamstress. Living with her were 3 daughters, Ruth, age 14, Grace, age 11, and Clara, age 7. The ages matched the apparent ages of the girls in the photograph. Most significantly, the census indicated that Eleanor owned her home free, meaning without a mortgage, a remarkable achievement for any woman in 1899, and extraordinary for a black woman. Dr. Mitchell cross-referenced the census data with Worcester property records. She found a deed dated March 1895, transferring ownership of a small house at 47 Cedar Street from a white family named Patterson to Eleanor, Negro woman, spinster. The purchase price was $800, paid in full at the time of transfer. Property tax records showed Eleanor had paid her taxes consistently and on time from 1895 through 1900. For a black woman to own property outright during this period was extraordinary and would have attracted attention, not all of it welcome. Dr. Mitchell traveled to Worcester to conduct research in person. The Worcester Public Library maintained an extensive archive of local newspapers on microfilm, including complete runs of the Worcester Daily Gazette and the Worcester Evening Post from the 1890s. She spent 3 full days scrolling through editions from 1897 to 1900, searching for any mention of black families, Cedar Street, or incidents of racial violence. The Worcester Daily Gazette archives contained multiple references to racial tensions during this period. The tone of the coverage reflected the virulent racism of the era, but the facts were documented clearly enough to reconstruct what had been happening in the city. The first significant article, dated April 23, 1897, was headlined, "Citizens Organized to Preserve Neighborhood Character." The article described the formation of a committee of white residents concerned about the encroachment of colored families into respectable districts. The committee chairman, identified as Thomas Bradford, a local businessman and property owner, was quoted extensively. The presence of colored residents in traditionally white neighborhoods threatens property values and disrupts the social fabric of our community. These people, however well-meaning individually, do not belong among us. We will take all necessary and legal measures to preserve our neighborhoods for the families who built them. The article listed several streets where black families had recently purchased homes, including Cedar Street. It noted that property values on these streets had declined as a result, though no actual data was provided to support this claim. The committee announced its intention to encourage black homeowners to sell their properties and relocate to more appropriate areas of the city. A second article, dated November 7, 1898, reported an incident of arson. A house on Cedar Street owned by a black family had burned during the night under what the article termed mysterious circumstances. The family, a couple with 2 young children, had escaped unharmed but had lost all their possessions. The husband told the newspaper that he had received threatening letters before the fire, warning him to leave the neighborhood. The police investigation, according to the article, concluded the fire had been caused by an overturned lamp, despite the family's insistence that they had been asleep and no lamps had been lit. Witnesses reported seeing several white men near the property shortly before flames were discovered, but no arrests were made. The family left Worcester within a week of the fire. The third article, published October 22, 1899, just 6 weeks after Eleanor's photograph was taken, described escalating tensions on Cedar Street. The headline read, "Colored Seamstress Defies Neighborhood Committee." According to the report, several black homeowners on Cedar Street had received letters demanding they sell their properties and leave Worcester. Most had complied, selling at significant losses. However, the colored seamstress at number 47 had refused all offers and had reportedly told neighbors she would not be intimidated. The article quoted an unnamed member of the Citizens Committee saying, "This woman's stubbornness is causing unnecessary conflict. She would be wise to accept a fair price for her property and move on before the situation deteriorates further." Dr. Mitchell photographed each article and cross-referenced the dates with other records. The pattern was clear. Black homeowners in Worcester faced systematic harassment, threats, and violence designed to force them out of neighborhoods where white residents objected to their presence. And Eleanor, the woman in the photograph, had been specifically identified in the newspaper as someone who refused to leave. Now Dr. Mitchell understood the context in which the photograph had been taken. This was not simply a family portrait. It was a document created during a period of active threat. The revolver in Eleanor's lap was not an oversight or a curious detail. It was a deliberate statement, a visual record of her determination to defend herself and her daughters against very real danger. Dr. Mitchell returned to Boston and immediately began searching for descendants of Eleanor and her daughters. She contacted several genealogical societies specializing in African American family history, posted inquiries on academic forums focused on post-Civil War black communities in New England, and reached out to churches in Worcester and Boston that had served black congregations in the early 1900s. Within a week, on March 28, 2024, she received an email that would break the case open. The sender was Patricia Johnson, a 67-year-old retired teacher living in Springfield, Massachusetts. Her message was brief, but electrifying. "I believe the woman in that photograph you're researching is my great-great-grandmother. Her name was Eleanor, and my family has always been told she was a woman who refused to run. I have documents and another photograph that might help your research. Can we meet?" Dr. Mitchell responded immediately, and they arranged to meet at the Boston Historical Society the following afternoon. Patricia arrived carrying a worn leather portfolio that had belonged to her grandmother. She was a tall woman with silver hair, dressed professionally, and she moved with quiet dignity. When Dr. Mitchell showed her the 1899 photograph on a high-resolution monitor, Patricia stared at it for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "That's her," Patricia said softly. "That's Eleanor. And those are her daughters, Ruth, Grace, and Clara. Clara was my great-grandmother. She was the only one who lived long enough for me to know her personally. She died in 1984, when I was 27 years old." Patricia opened the leather portfolio carefully. Inside were several documents preserved in archival plastic sleeves, birth certificates, a family Bible with handwritten genealogical records dating back to the 1850s, several letters, and one additional photograph, a formal portrait of an elderly black woman taken in what appeared to be the 1920s or early 1930s. On the back, in careful handwriting, someone had written, "Eleanor, age 67, Boston, 1927. Dr. Mitchell examined the later photograph closely. The woman was clearly much older, her face lined with age, her hair completely white, but the resemblance was unmistakable. The same strong bone structure, the same penetrating gaze, the same set to her jaw that conveyed determination and quiet strength. This was Eleanor, nearly 3 decades after the 1899 photograph, having survived whatever threats she had faced. "She lived until 1932, Patricia explained. "She died during the Depression at 71 years old. My great-grandmother Clara was with her at the end. Before Grandma Clara passed away in 1984, she told me stories about her mother, about Eleanor's strength, her courage, and what the family endured in Worcester." Patricia arranged several documents on the table. "My grandmother told me that Eleanor had been born into slavery in Virginia in 1861, just before the Civil War started. She was freed as a small child when the war ended, though her mother had died during the conflict. Eleanor made her way north as a teenager, working as a domestic servant first in Richmond, then in Baltimore, and finally in Boston. She learned to sew, became skilled at dressmaking, and eventually saved enough money to start her own business." Dr. Mitchell listened intently, taking notes. "When did she move to Worcester?" "In 1892 or 1893, I think. She had heard there were opportunities there for skilled seamstresses, wealthy families who wanted custom dresses. She built up a clientele among white middle-class women. The work was steady and paid well enough that she could save money. In 1895, she bought that house on Cedar Street. It was the proudest achievement of her life." Patricia's voice grew heavier. "But buying that house also made her a target." Patricia carefully removed a bundle of letters from the portfolio, tied with a faded blue ribbon. "These belong to Eleanor. My grandmother kept them her entire life, and passed them to my mother, who gave them to me. I think you need to see them." Dr. Mitchell put on white cotton conservation gloves and gently took the bundle. The letters were written on cheap paper that had yellowed and become brittle with age. She untied the ribbon carefully and unfolded the first letter. It was dated August 12, 1899, written in crude cursive with several misspellings. The letter had no salutation and was unsigned, but its message was chillingly clear. "You have been warned. Colored people do not belong on Cedar Street. This is a white neighborhood for decent families. Sell your property and leave Worcester, or you will face consequences. Your stubbornness puts your children in danger. We are giving you 1 month to make arrangements. This is your final notice before we take action. Dr. Mitchell felt a chill reading the words. This was not a vague threat. It was a specific ultimatum with a deadline. She carefully set the letter aside and picked up the second one, dated August 20th, 1899. This letter was even more explicit and disturbing. It described in graphic, violent detail what would happen to Eleanor and her daughters if she did not comply with the demand to leave. The language was deliberately designed to terrify, invoking both sexual violence and murder. Dr. Mitchell read it once, documented it photographically, and set it aside without reading it aloud. Some historical documents were too painful to repeat verbatim. The third document in the bundle was different. It was written in Eleanor's own hand. The script was educated and careful, the spelling perfect, the language formal and deliberate. It was dated September 3rd, 1899, just 9 days before the photograph was taken. The letter was addressed to whom it may concern and stated, "I am Eleanor, a free woman, a citizen, and a property owner in the city of Worcester, Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I have broken no laws. I pay my taxes in full and on time. I conduct my business honestly. I raise my daughters to be respectable, hardworking, and God-fearing. I will not be driven from my home by threats, intimidation, or violence. I have taken lawful measures to protect myself and my family. Any man who comes to my door with ill intent will be met with appropriate resistance. I am prepared to defend what is mine. This house was purchased with money I earned through my own labor. It is my daughter's inheritance, their security, their future. I will not surrender it to terror. Let it be known that I stand my ground." Dr. Mitchell read the letter twice, feeling the power of Eleanor's words across 125 years of history. This was not just defiance. It was a formal declaration, a legal and moral assertion of her rights as a human being and a citizen. The language was carefully chosen, emphasizing legality, respectability, and legitimate self-defense. Eleanor was constructing a public record, establishing her position so that if violence came, there would be documentation of her attempt to avoid it while asserting her right to exist. "Did she ever send this letter?" Dr. Mitchell asked. Patricia shook her head. "I don't think so. I think she wrote it to clarify her own mind, to put her position into words. But Grandma Clara told me that Eleanor did something else with it. She showed it to her pastor, Reverend William Hayes, and asked him to keep a copy. She wanted someone outside the family to know her intentions, to have a record of what she was facing." "And the photograph?" Dr. Mitchell asked, though she was beginning to understand. Patricia nodded. Grandma said Eleanor had the photograph made specifically to send to the men who had threatened her. She wanted them to see her face, to see her daughters, and to see that she was armed and unafraid. She had the photographer make 6 copies. She kept one for herself, gave one to Reverend Hayes, and personally delivered 4 others to the men she knew were behind the threats. Dr. Mitchell was astonished. She knew who they were. The black community in Worcester was small. People talked. Everyone knew who was on that citizens committee, who had been involved in driving other families out. Eleanor found out their names and where they lived, and she made sure they each received a copy of that photograph. "What happened after that?" Dr. Mitchell asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. Patricia's expression darkened. 2 weeks later, they came for her. According to Clara's detailed account, as preserved through family oral history and now shared by Patricia, the weeks following the photograph's delivery in mid-September 1899 were tense but outwardly quiet. Eleanor continued her seamstress work, though several of her regular white clients abruptly canceled their standing orders, offering no explanations. New clients stopped coming. The economic pressure was deliberate, an attempt to force Eleanor into financial desperation that would compel her to sell the house. The 3 daughters attended the small school for black children on the east side of Worcester, about a mile from Cedar Street. Eleanor walked them to school each morning and picked them up each afternoon, never allowing them to travel alone. She kept the revolver, a .32 caliber Smith & Wesson that she had purchased legally from a firearms dealer in Boston, loaded and within reach at all times. At night, she slept in the front room of the house rather than in her bedroom upstairs, positioning herself between any potential threat and her daughters. On the night of October 17, 1899, 4 men approached Eleanor's house just after midnight. Clara, then 7 years old, woke to the sound of shattering glass. Someone had thrown a large rock through the front window. The rock landed in the center of the front room, wrapped in paper that bore a single word written in black paint, "Tonight." Eleanor was already awake, sitting in the front room in darkness, her revolver in her lap, positioned exactly as she had been in the photograph taken 5 weeks earlier. She had been expecting this. She did not light a lamp. She did not call out. She moved quietly to the staircase and whispered up to her daughters, telling them to stay in the back bedroom no matter what they heard, and to stay away from the windows. Ruth, the oldest at 14, gathered her younger sisters Clara and Grace in the back bedroom as instructed. They huddled together in the darkness, listening to the sounds from outside. Men's voices, harsh and angry, shouting for Eleanor to come out. Footsteps on the porch. The sound of someone testing the front door, finding it locked. Then the men began pounding on the door, demanding Eleanor open it. When she remained silent, they threatened to break it down. Eleanor, still in darkness, moved to a position behind the heavy wooden table she had positioned earlier near the door. She called out once, her voice steady. "This is my home. You are trespassing. Leave now, or I will defend my property." The response was laughter and more threats. Then one of the men began forcing the door with a heavy tool, probably a crowbar or an axe handle. The door frame began to splinter. Eleanor aimed her revolver at the center of the door and fired once. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet punched through the door at chest height, and outside there was sudden silence, then cursing and the sound of men scrambling back from the porch. For several minutes, nothing happened. Clara would later recall the terrible silence, broken only by her own terrified breathing and Grace's quiet crying. Ruth held both her sisters, whispering prayers. Then they smelled smoke. The men had moved to the sides and back of the house and were throwing lit torches onto the roof and against the wooden siding. Eleanor faced an impossible choice: stay inside and risk her daughters burning to death, or go outside and confront armed men who intended to harm her family. She chose the only option that might save her children. She ran upstairs, gathered Ruth, Grace, and Clara, and led them down to the back door. She told Ruth to run with her sisters directly to Reverend Hayes' house 3 blocks away, to stay off the main streets, and not to look back. Ruth, though terrified, did as her mother commanded. She took Clara's hand, made sure Grace stayed close, and ran into the darkness. Eleanor watched until they disappeared around the corner. Then she returned to the front of the house, revolver in hand, and stepped out onto the porch. The 4 men stood at the property line, visible in the growing firelight. They had expected her to flee or to be trapped inside, but they had not expected her to come out armed and facing them directly. For a long, frozen moment, no one moved. The Worcester Fire Department responded to the blaze within 15 minutes. Remarkably fast response time for 1899. By the time the horse-drawn fire wagon arrived, the roof of Eleanor's house was fully engulfed in flames and fire was spreading down the walls. Firefighters immediately began working to contain the blaze and prevent it from spreading to neighboring houses. They found Eleanor standing in her front yard, revolver clearly visible in her hand, facing 4 white men who stood roughly 20 feet away at the edge of her property. The standoff had frozen everyone in place. None of the men had fled when they heard the fire wagon approaching, which suggested a degree of confidence that they would not face consequences. 2 police officers arrived shortly after the fire brigade. What happened next would determine everything that followed: whether Eleanor would be arrested for brandishing a weapon, whether the 4 men would face any accountability, or whether the entire incident would be dismissed as a dispute, with no charges filed against anyone. The critical factor was the arrival of Reverend William Hayes. Patricia explained the background. Reverend Hayes was an exceptional man. He was black, but he had served as a chaplain in a white Union regiment during the Civil War, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry. He had maintained relationships with several white veterans from that regiment, men who had fought alongside black soldiers and who, unlike most white people of that era, genuinely respected black people's humanity and rights. When Eleanor had first received threats in August, she had gone to Reverend Hayes for counsel. He had given her practical advice: document everything, create evidence of the threats, make your case public through trusted witnesses, and if violence comes, make absolutely certain there are credible witnesses present who can testify to what actually happened. On the night of October 17th, after Ruth arrived at his house with her terrified sisters, Reverend Hayes immediately understood what was happening. He sent his wife to care for the girls, then he ran to fetch 2 specific men, Captain James Morrison and Lieutenant Henry Fisher, both white veterans of the 54th Massachusetts who lived in Worcester and who had remained friends with Reverend Hayes for over 30 years. These men had social standing, credibility, and most importantly, they were known to be honest. The 3 of them arrived at Eleanor's house just before the police. They witnessed the entire scene: Eleanor standing in her yard, armed but not threatening anyone, simply holding her ground, 4 white men with torches, some of which were still burning, and Eleanor's house engulfed in flames. Captain Morrison immediately approached the police officers and identified himself, then calmly described what he and his companions had witnessed upon arrival. The presence of 2 respected white veterans changed the entire dynamic. The police could not simply dismiss the incident or arrest only Eleanor. They took statements from everyone present, and under Captain Morrison's insistence, they arrested all 4 white men on charges of arson and attempted assault. The 4 defendants were Thomas Bradford, the chairman of the Citizens Committee who had been quoted in the newspaper, his son Richard, age 26, James Morris, a local merchant, and Albert Clark, a factory foreman. They were represented by expensive legal counsel and immediately posted bail. Their defense strategy was predictable. They claimed they had gone to Eleanor's house merely to negotiate a final offer to purchase her property, and that she had fired upon them without provocation, causing them to flee in fear. The fire, they suggested, had been started by an overturned lamp inside the house, implying Eleanor had set it herself, either accidentally or deliberately. The trial took place in December 1899 at Worcester County Court. Newspaper coverage was minimal and dismissive. The Worcester Daily Gazette ran a brief item noting that 4 men were tried for property destruction related to a dispute involving a colored woman on Cedar Street. But Reverend Hayes, understanding the historical importance of the case, kept detailed personal notes of the proceedings. Eleanor testified in her own defense. No transcript of her testimony survives, but Reverend Hayes recorded that she spoke for nearly an hour, calmly and precisely. She presented the threatening letters as evidence. She testified about the pattern of intimidation against black homeowners in Worcester, including the 1898 arson that had driven another family away. She explained her decision to commission the photograph with a revolver visible, not as a threat, but as documentation of her reasonable fear and her legal right to self-defense. Most dramatically, Captain Morrison and Lieutenant Fisher testified. They described arriving at the scene and witnessing 4 men with torches and a burning house, with Eleanor standing in her yard having clearly defended her property and sent her children to safety. They testified that Eleanor had not threatened anyone, had not advanced toward the men, and had simply stood her ground on her own property. The jury, composed entirely of white men, as was legally required in Massachusetts at that time, deliberated for 3 hours. The verdict was guilty on charges of arson and attempted assault. The judge sentenced each defendant to 6 months in the county jail and fines of $200 each. Substantial sums, but far less than the maximum penalties allowed under law. For 1899, however, any conviction at all of white men for crimes against a black victim was extraordinary. Eleanor had won her case, but the cost was devastating. The house on Cedar Street was severely damaged by the fire. The entire roof had been destroyed, and water from the firefighting efforts had ruined much of the interior structure, furniture, and Eleanor's sewing equipment. The house was technically still standing, but it was uninhabitable and would require extensive repairs. Eleanor filed an insurance claim with the National Property Insurance Company, which had issued her a homeowner's policy when she purchased the property in 1895. The company sent an adjuster to examine the damage in late October. In early November, Eleanor received a letter denying her claim. The reason given was that the fire had been caused by civil unrest and racial conflict related to her presence in a white neighborhood, an exclusion clause in the policy that essentially blamed her for being the victim of a hate crime. The company argued that because the fire had been deliberately set during a dispute, rather than being an accident, the policy did not apply. Eleanor hired an attorney, a black lawyer from Boston who took the case without fee, and challenged the denial. The legal process dragged on for months. Meanwhile, Eleanor faced the immediate crisis of having 3 daughters to house and feed, with no home, damaged equipment, and a business that had effectively collapsed, as all her remaining white clients had abandoned her. The black community in Worcester, though small and economically struggling itself, organized to help. Reverend Hayes led a fundraising effort. They held church suppers where people paid small amounts for meals, with all proceeds going to Eleanor's house fund. They collected donations after Sunday services. They reached out to sympathetic white allies, including Captain Morrison and Lieutenant Fisher, who contributed and encouraged others to do so. Over 6 weeks, the community raised 300 baptis, an extraordinary sum representing hundreds of small donations from people who had very little themselves. Eleanor contributed the remaining $80 from her personal savings, and by February 1900, she had enough to hire contractors to repair the house. The work was completed in April 1900. But Eleanor understood that Worcester would never be safe for her family. The 4 convicted men had been released from jail after serving only 4 months of their 6-month sentences, shortened for good behavior. The Bradford family and their allies remained influential in the city. Thomas Bradford's business continued to operate successfully. He faced no social consequences for his actions. Threats continued, though more subtly now. Ruth, now 15, reported being followed home from school by groups of white boys who called her vile names, but never quite crossed the line into physical assault. Grace, 12, was refused entry to the public library by a clerk who claimed colored patrons were only allowed on certain days, a rule that did not officially exist, but was enforced nonetheless. Clara, 8 years old, was pushed down on the street by older white children while adults watched without intervening. Eleanor made her decision in March 1900. She would sell the house and move her family to Boston, where a larger and more established black community offered some measure of safety in numbers. She found a black family recently arrived from Georgia who were looking for a home in Worcester and were unaware of the dangers. Eleanor sold them the house for $650, nearly $200 less than she had paid for it 5 years earlier, but she made sure to tell them the complete history of what had happened. The family, having already experienced worse violence in the South, decided to take the risk. They believed the fact that 4 white men had been convicted might actually offer them some protection, as it established legal precedent that black homeowners had rights. Eleanor used the $650 to relocate to Boston's South End, where she rented a modest apartment in a building owned by a black landlord. She restarted her seamstress business, this time working almost exclusively for black clients and a small number of progressive white families in abolitionist circles who sought her out, specifically because they had heard about her case. The work was steady, though less profitable than her Worcester business had been at its peak. Eleanor never owned property again. The trauma of Worcester had taught her that visibility and economic success could be deadly for black families in America. Ruth, Grace, and Clara all survived to adulthood, growing up in Boston's black community. Ruth became a school teacher, teaching at the elementary school for black children in Roxbury. Grace married a postal worker and raised 4 children. Clara, Patricia's grandmother, worked as a housekeeper for a white family in Cambridge and later raised 5 children of her own, including Patricia's mother. Eleanor lived until 1932, dying at age 71 during the early years of the Great Depression. She had lived to see her daughters grow, marry, and have children. She never returned to Worcester, not even once. According to Clara, Eleanor rarely spoke about what had happened there, but she kept the 1899 photograph, the one with the revolver visible in her lap, in her Bible until the day she died. It was found there by Clara when she went through her mother's belongings after the funeral. Dr. Sarah Mitchell spent the weeks following her meetings with Patricia contextualizing Eleanor's story within the broader framework of post-Civil War black history in America. What had happened to Eleanor was not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic, nationwide campaign of racial terror designed to limit black economic and social advancement, even in northern states that had abolished slavery decades earlier. Research into Worcester's demographic history revealed striking patterns. Between 1890 and 1910, the city's black population remained remarkably stable at approximately 600 people, less than half of 1% of the total population, which grew from 85,000 to over 145,000 during the same period. This stability was not natural demographic stagnation. It was the result of deliberate exclusion. Black families who attempted to settle in Worcester faced organized resistance that either drove them away or prevented them from coming at all. Dr. Mitchell discovered documentation of at least 5 separate organizations formed by white Worcester residents between 1890 and 1920 with the explicit purpose of preventing black families from purchasing homes in white neighborhoods. These organizations had formal membership, elected leadership, regular meetings, and coordinated strategies. They were not fringe groups, but included respected businessmen, professionals, and civic leaders. Their activities included organizing boycotts of black-owned businesses, pressuring white businesses not to serve black customers, pooling money to outbid black buyers on property sales, lobbying city officials to refuse building permits for black homeowners, and when all else failed, resorting to intimidation and violence. This pattern was not unique to Worcester. Dr. Mitchell examined historical records from dozens of northern cities and found nearly identical dynamics. In Springfield, Massachusetts, the black population actually declined between 1890 and 1910 despite the city's overall growth. In Hartford, Connecticut, black home ownership rates dropped precipitously during the same period, even as the black population grew slightly. In Providence, Rhode Island, black families were effectively confined to a single neighborhood through a combination of restrictive covenants, lending discrimination, and organized harassment. The violence Eleanor faced was part of a national epidemic of racial terror. During the 1890s and early 1900s, thousands of black families across America were driven from their homes and communities through arson, mob violence, and economic coercion. In the South, this period saw the height of lynching. Nearly 2,000 documented lynchings occurred between 1889 and 1918, the vast majority of victims being black men, though black women and even children were also murdered by white mobs. Jim Crow laws were systematically implemented across the South, legally codifying racial segregation and black subordination. In the North, the violence was less visible but still pervasive. Rather than public spectacles of lynching, Northern racial terror took the form of targeted attacks on individual families, economic warfare, and legal manipulation. The goal was the same: to maintain white supremacy and prevent black economic advancement. Northern white people often prided themselves on being less racist than Southerners, but the practical results were remarkably similar. Black people were confined to certain neighborhoods, certain occupations, and certain social positions, with violence or economic destruction awaiting those who challenged these boundaries. What made Eleanor's case exceptional was not that she faced threats and violence that was tragically common, but that she successfully fought back within the legal system and won a conviction against her attackers. Dr. Mitchell's research revealed that convictions of white people for crimes against black victims in northern states during this period were extraordinarily rare. Most cases were never prosecuted at all. Police and prosecutors routinely declined to pursue charges, claiming insufficient evidence or dismissing incidents as disputes rather than crimes. When cases did go to trial, all white juries almost invariably acquitted white defendants regardless of evidence. Eleanor's successful prosecution resulted from a unique convergence of factors: the credibility provided by white Union veteran witnesses whose reputations made it impossible for the jury to dismiss their testimony, the organizational support of Reverend Hayes and the black community, who ensured proper documentation and legal representation, Eleanor's own strategic thinking in creating evidence of the threats through the photograph and preserved letters, and perhaps a degree of luck in drawing. A judge and jury who were willing to convict despite prevailing racial attitudes. Dr. Mitchell also researched the revolver itself. Smith & Wesson .32 caliber revolvers were widely available during the 1890s and were specifically marketed to women for self-defense. Advertisements from the period show firearms companies promoting small caliber revolvers as ladies' protection against burglars and assailants. For a woman, white or black, to own such a weapon was not particularly unusual. What was extraordinary was Eleanor's willingness to display it publicly and, if necessary, use it against white men. Black people who defended themselves against white attackers were routinely prosecuted for assault or murder, even when acting in clear self-defense. Eleanor's decision to arm herself and to make that fact known was therefore both practical and politically radical, an assertion of her right to exist, to own property, and to protect her family, regardless of white opposition. On June 15, 2024, the Boston Historical Society opened a special exhibition titled Eleanor Portrait of Resistance, 1899. The exhibition occupied the museum's main gallery and had been designed in close collaboration with Patricia Johnson and her extended family. Dr. Sarah Mitchell served as lead curator and had spent 3 months assembling historical materials, writing interpretive texts, and designing the display to honor Eleanor's courage while placing her story in proper historical context. The centerpiece of the exhibition was the 1899 photograph, displayed under museum-quality lighting and climate control. Beside it, a high-resolution magnified detail clearly showed the revolver in Eleanor's lap, with explanatory text describing what it was and why it was there. The threatening letters Eleanor had received were displayed in protective cases, alongside Eleanor's handwritten response. Reverend Hayes' trial notes were presented in full, allowing visitors to read first-hand accounts of the proceedings. Maps showed Cedar Street in 1899 Worcester, photographs of the city during that era, and demographic data illustrating the tiny size of Worcester's black community. Newspaper articles from the period were reproduced, showing the racist rhetoric and documenting the organized campaign against black homeowners. The exhibition also included the 1927 photograph of elderly Eleanor, showing visitors that she had survived and lived nearly 3 more decades. Family documents traced what had happened to Ruth, Grace, and Clara, how all 3 had built lives, raised families, and contributed to their communities despite the trauma they had endured. A family tree showed Eleanor's descendants, now numbering more than 40 people across 4 generations. Patricia attended the opening with 17 members of her extended family. Eleanor's descendants, meeting in many cases for the first time. The photograph had brought them together. Many had known fragments of the family story, but had never heard the complete account or seen the documentary evidence that confirmed it was all true. Dr. Mitchell gave the opening presentation to a crowd of over 200 people, museum members, historians, journalists, community leaders, and members of the public who had heard about the discovery and wanted to understand its significance. She spoke for 30 minutes, carefully walking through Eleanor's story, explaining the historical context, and articulating why this photograph and this story mattered for understanding American history. This photograph, Dr. Mitchell explained, is a primary source document that reveals truths often erased from official historical records. Eleanor's decision to hold that revolver in her lap, to have it photographed, and to send copies to the men who threatened her was an act of immense courage. She understood that her family's survival depended on making it absolutely clear she would not be an easy victim. By preserving this image, she left evidence for future generations, for us, to understand what black families endured and how they resisted. Eleanor's story is both exceptional and representative. It is exceptional because she successfully defended herself and achieved a measure of justice in court, outcomes that were tragically rare for black families in 1899. It is representative because the violence, discrimination, and terror she faced were common experiences for millions of black Americans during this period, in both the South and the North. Her story gives us insight into the daily reality of black life after the Civil War, a reality of constant threat, of having to be perpetually vigilant, of knowing that success and visibility could be deadly. The exhibition received extensive media coverage. Major newspapers and magazines ran features on Eleanor's story, often using the photograph as their lead image. NPR produced a radio documentary. Several history podcasts devoted episodes to discussing the case and its implications. Academic historians of African American life in New England began using the photograph and associated documents in their research and teaching. For Patricia and her family, however, the exhibition provided something more personal than academic recognition. It provided validation and reclamation. For so long, Patricia told a reporter from the Boston Globe, our family history was just oral tradition. We knew these stories, but we had no proof, no documentation that would make other people believe us. Grandma Clara would tell me about her mother's courage, but there was always this sense that maybe she was exaggerating, or maybe memory had changed things over time. Now we have proof. Now everyone can see what my great-great-grandmother faced and how she refused to be broken. That photograph is her testimony, and finally, people are listening. Monet, the 1899 portrait of Eleanor and her daughters, once nearly discarded as worthless in an estate sale, now resides in the permanent collection of the Boston Historical Society, accessioned as a major acquisition in American historical photography. It has been digitized and is available for educational use. Multiple universities have requested permission to include it in their curriculum materials on post-Civil War African American history, the history of racism in the North, and the history of black resistance and resilience. The photograph stands as a testament to one woman's courage, to the violence and systematic racism of the post-Civil War era, and to the power of black families to survive, resist, and preserve their stories against overwhelming odds. The revolver hidden in Eleanor's lap, barely visible to the casual observer but unmistakably present to those who look closely, has become one of the most powerful symbols in American photographic history. A mother's promise to protect her children, captured forever in silver and light, a declaration that she would not be moved, would not be intimidated, and would not surrender what she had built through her own labor and courage. Eleanor's house on Cedar Street in Worcester no longer stands. It was demolished in the 1960s during urban renewal. But her photograph endures, and through it, her voice still speaks across 125 years, testifying to the reality of black life in America, and the fierce determination of those who refuse to accept injustice as inevitable.